The American Revolution, 1774 to 1783. When the first Continental Congresses appealed to King George III, the Declaration of Rights, reached Britain in 1774, it was, to put it mildly, poorly received. Massachusetts was now considered to be an open rebellion, and soon fresh troops began arriving to enforce British laws and policies. Key concepts. Both the British and the Americans had military, political, and economic advantages and disadvantages in the war. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point in the war, for it persuaded the French to give what provided to be significant help to the Americans in the war for independence. Black Americans played an important role in the war. The American victory did not fundamentally change the condition or status of blacks or women. Creation of the U.S. Constitution, 1781 to 1791. When Virginia's Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution in the Second Continental Congress on June 7, 1776, in favor of American independence, he also proposed that a government be established based on an accord of Confederate States and association of sovereign states. Within a month, under the direction of John Dickinson, a committee established by the Congress had devised a plan of government called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. The Articles of Confederation were adopted by the Congress the next year and were finally approved by all the states in 1781. By 1787, it was clear that the Articles were insufficient for the young nation. A convention charged with the revising of the Articles concluded that an entirely new structure was needed. The Constitution was the result. In this chapter, we will look at the Founding Fathers and how they came to write the Constitution. Key concepts. The Articles of Confederation were unable to address the economic and political problems facing the new nation. The Constitution was completed only because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were able to reach a number of major compromises. Opposition to ratification of the Constitution came from anti-federalists who feared a strong central government. Promise of a Bill of Rights was important to the ratification of the Constitution. Chapter 5. The New Nation, 1789 to 1800. In March of 1789, the first Congress to serve under the new Constitution assembled in what was the nation's capital, New York City. They immediately set to work continuing the presidential electors' ballots and declared that George Washington and John Adams had been unanimously elected. 1 month later, Washington and Adams were sworn in as the nation's first president and vice president. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox were appointed to the newly created departments in the executive branch: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of War in that order. These appointments gave birth to the cabinet system, whereby the president appoints individuals to head the different departments of the executive branch of a government. For its part, the Congress made good on its promise to incorporate a Bill of Rights into the Constitution. Also, believing it had a mandate to address the nation's pressing economic needs and in the process facilitate capital accumulation, the Congress also passed a protective tariffs to raise revenue and protect the nation's infant manufacturing. In order to give greater definition to the judicial branch, they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the Supreme Court, with John Jay as Chief Justice and a lower federal court system. Obviously, Congress was taking steps to make certain that the federal government would be, if anything, more active than the previous one. But the political disputes that shaped the constitutional ratification debate would soon spill over into the federal government and ultimately lead to the rise of political parties. Key concepts. Hamilton's economic plan promoted manufacturing and enlarged the role of government. The Bank of the United States and the tariff were opposed in rural areas and southern states. There were both differences and similarities between Hamilton and Jeffersonian movements. The election of Jefferson is referred to as the Revolution of 1800. The Marshall Court defied the role and powers of the judicial court branch. Relations with France and Britain were strained under Adams and Jefferson. Chapter 6. The United States has been consistent in its foreign policy in that it has always had an expansionist tendencies, or, as one historian has phrased it, empire as a way of life. Key concepts. Territorial expansion was an objective of the U.S. from its inception, as witnessed by the removal of Native Americans and by the Mexican-American War. Various groups and ideologies supported territorial expansion for economic, political, and cultural reasons. Controversial British actions and American policies aggravated relations between the two nations, leading to the War of 1812. New England and Federalists strongly opposed the war and floated the idea of secession. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. established a policy of hegemony dominance in the Western Hemisphere. U.S. Foreign Affairs from 1812 to the 1850s. Chapter 7. Jacksonian Democracy and the Age of Reform. Paradoxically, at the same time the United States was acquiring land, often through conquest, it was engaged in democratizing its own institutions. This era, the 1820s to the 1850s, has been referred to as the Age of Reform. Some historians, however, choose to title the period after its most celebrated president, Andrew Jackson, and refer to it as the Jacksonian Democracy. It is important to note, however, that this designation is challenged by historians who maintain that Jackson was actually indifferent, opposed to, or unaware of some of the reforms. Those critical of the term see obvious contradictory impulses present during this period: slavery, expansion, and imperialism, and the marginalization of blacks, women, Native Americans, and laborers. Yet over the years, the terms have come to mean the same thing: an unprecedented expansion of egalitarian ideas that transformed America socially, politically, and economically, if only for white men. Key concepts: social, economic, and political conditions and attitudes led to the reform spirit in the mid-19th century. As the Federalist Party faded, an era of good feeling set in. The second party system took shape as the National Republicans challenged the Democrats. Grassroots movement and government reforms attempted to address the social and economic problems confronting the nation. The intellectual roots of reform shapes perception of the individual's role in society.